Something was wrong with the human they sent me, and I knew it from the first second I looked at him. My name is Vitheris Kelani. I am a Salith diplomat, born on a world of crystal spires and low gravity, where my kind evolved to feel what others feel. We are empaths. Every emotion in a room lands on my skin like rain. Fear tastes like copper. Joy hums like a tuning fork behind my ribs. Anger is heat, real heat, the kind that makes me sweat even in a cold room. We can push deeper if we want. We can read actual thoughts, peel back the layers of a mind like pages in a book. But we do not. Ever. It is the one unbreakable law of our people. To read another mind without consent is a trespass so severe that the last Salith who did it was stripped of her rank, her family, and her name, and sent to walk alone across the salt flats of our southern continent until the wind took her. So I do not read minds. I catch what drifts toward me, and I use it to do my job, which is to negotiate with aliens who would rather see my delegation fail than succeed. I was 26 days into my first deep space posting aboard Relay Station Andros 9, a diplomatic hub the size of a small moon, when a Terran embassy official walked into my office with a man behind him and told me his name was Ethan Cole. Sergeant Major Cole will serve as your cultural liaison for the duration of your assignment, the official said. He smiled the way humans smile when they are being political, which is to say he did not mean it. Standard protocol for Allied delegations. I looked at Ethan Cole. He was tall by human standards, which made him roughly my height. Broad, heavy, built by a world with twice the gravity of mine, with dense bones and thick muscle packed under skin that had clearly seen sun and weather and hard years. His hair was dark and cut short. His eyes were the color of wet stone, gray with flecks of something almost green, and they moved across the room in a sweep before they settled on me. He had scars on his knuckles, old ones, faded white. "Ma'am," he said. "Sergeant Cole." 3 words. That was all I got. His voice was flat and even, like a line drawn with a ruler. No warmth, no coldness, just nothing. But that was not what disturbed me. What disturbed me was his emotional signature. Every living being in this galaxy has one. Sit beside a Dren Collective member, and you feel the slow, deep current of their aquatic patience. Even the station's maintenance workers give off the low static of boredom or fatigue, or the small bright sparks of anticipation before a meal. Ethan Cole gave off almost nothing. Not silence. Silence I could understand. What I felt from him was compression. Something vast and deliberate. Packed down tight. Held behind a wall so thick I could barely sense its edges. It was like standing next to a sealed vault and hearing the faintest vibration from inside. Something was in there. Something enormous. But he had locked it away with a discipline I had never encountered in any species. I dismissed him internally within the first minute. Humans were the galaxy's least remarkable species. No telepathy. No hive mind. No biological advantages that mattered outside their own heavy, brutal little planet. They were useful for security, manual labor, and eating things no other species would touch. The galaxy tolerated them the way you tolerate a loud neighbor. You do not invite them to dinner, but you nod when you see them in the corridor. I nodded at Ethan Cole and went back to my work. He did not leave. He stood near the door, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward, and simply existed there, like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Over the next several days, I learned that this was his permanent state. I ate breakfast in the delegation mess hall, and he sat at the next table, facing the entrance. I attended diplomatic briefings with the Kethvari and Dren delegations, and he stood against the wall, motionless. I walked to my quarters after a 14-hour session that left me so empathically drained I could barely see straight, and he was 10 steps behind me, his footsteps steady as a metronome. I told him on the 4th day that he did not need to follow me everywhere. He changed nothing. I told him on the 6th day that I appreciated the Terran embassy's courtesy, but I was perfectly safe on a diplomatic station with its own security force. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He changed nothing. On the 8th day, I stopped telling him anything at all. The treaty negotiations were my world. The Salith Concord had sent me to Andros 9 to negotiate mineral extraction rights in the Velen Reach, a belt of resource-rich asteroids that 3 species claimed and none fully controlled. The Kethvari wanted exclusive rights. The Dren wanted shared access. My delegation wanted fair distribution based on proximity and need. It was exactly the kind of slow, careful, high-stakes diplomacy that the Salith were built for, because we could feel the truth beneath the words. First Speaker Thesic of the Kethvari was my primary obstacle. He was tall, even for his insectoid species, with mandibles that clicked when he was irritated, which was always. His emotional signature was a furnace of contempt and barely controlled hostility. He loathed the Salith, not because we had wronged his people, but because our empathic abilities made it impossible for him to lie without us knowing. And the Kethvari built their entire diplomatic strategy on deception. Every session with Thesic left me raw. His contempt was corrosive, the kind of emotion that sticks to you and burns slowly. And I spent my evenings in my quarters trying to shed it the way you shed a coat that smells of smoke. I was returning from a state dinner, walking a long, quiet corridor that connected the diplomatic wing to the residential quarter. It was late. The station was in its night cycle. The overhead lights dimmed to a deep blue that mimicked twilight. Ethan was behind me, as always. I was tired. My empathic shields were thin from hours of absorbing the emotional chaos of 50 diplomats drinking and performing for each other. It was not anger, not fear, not boredom. It was focus. The kind of focus that has nothing to do with thought and everything to do with instinct. Predatory awareness, sharp and ancient. The feeling of a creature that has spotted movement in the underbrush and is calculating distance and speed without conscious effort. And it was not directed at me. It was directed at something behind me, something further down the corridor, in the dim blue dark, where I could see nothing and no one. I stopped walking and turned to look at him. He met my eyes. That flat, gray gaze, steady as bedrock. "Everything all right, ma'am?" I stared at him for a long moment. The flash was gone. His emotional wall was sealed again, smooth and impenetrable. Whatever he had sensed, whatever he had been reacting to, was locked away behind that impossible discipline. "Fine," I said. "Just tired." He nodded once and waited for me to keep walking. I did, but the exhaustion was gone, replaced by something else. A question that lodged in my chest like a splinter. Because that flash had not been the reaction of a cultural liaison who noticed a crowd getting thick. That was the reaction of a predator marking a threat. Fast, reflexive, and controlled with a precision that spoke of years of practice. I sat at my desk in the blue glow of the station's nightlights and opened the diplomatic personnel database. Every Allied staff member assigned to our wing had a file, accessible to delegation leaders for security purposes. Terran Armed Forces. Assigned to Salith Delegation, Andris 9. Role, Cultural Liaison. Service History, Restricted. Previous Postings, Restricted. Training Certifications, Restricted. Operational Record, Restricted. I scrolled to the bottom of the file. There was one note, unredacted, stamped with the personal seal of the Terran ambassador to Andris 9. It read, Asset reassigned from active theater. Non-negotiable placement. Do not remove from post. I read it 3 times. Asset. Not personnel. Not staff member. Asset. Non-negotiable placement. Meaning someone had tried to remove him, and the ambassador had overruled them. Do not remove from post. A command, not a request. Written in the language of someone who expected to be obeyed, and would not explain why. I closed the file, and sat in the dark for a long time. The man who stood behind me every day, who sat at the next table while I ate, who walked 10 paces behind me through every corridor on this station, was not a cultural liaison. His file was classified at a level I had never seen applied to diplomatic support staff. He had been pulled from an active military operation, whatever that meant for humans, and placed with me specifically, permanently, by someone with the authority to make it stick. I thought about his emotional compression, that sealed vault with something enormous inside it. I thought about the scars on his knuckles. And for the first time since I arrived on Andris 9, I felt something I could not blame on anyone else's emotional signature. I felt afraid. Not of Ethan Cole. That was the strange part. Despite everything I had just read, despite the classified file and the military record and the predator flash in the corridor, I was not afraid of him. His emotional wall was thick, yes. Unreadable, yes. But what little I had caught from behind it did not feel dangerous. Not to me. I was afraid of what his presence meant. Because my colleague Calith, a Salith who had served on stations like this one for a decade, had once told me something I had not understood until now. The humans do not waste their soldiers, she had said. If they put one next to you, it is because they know something you do not. And what they know is usually something you do not want to learn. I looked at the door of my quarters. Behind it, the corridor was silent. But I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that Ethan Cole was out there. Not sleeping, not resting, watching. The question was no longer who he was. The question was what he was watching for. I started paying attention after that night, and once I did, I could not stop seeing things I wished I had not noticed. It began with small details, the kind of things that, on their own, could be explained away as coincidence or routine maintenance. But taken together, they formed a pattern that made my skin prickle and my bioluminescent markings flicker with unease. The atmospheric filter in my quarters was replaced 3 days before its scheduled maintenance. I only knew this because I checked the maintenance logs on a restless impulse, scrolling through weeks of records looking for anything unusual. No reason was given, just a service code and an authorization stamp I did not recognize. A corridor I used every morning between my quarters and the council chamber was closed for 2 days. The posted reason was atmospheric recalibration, a routine procedure that happened across the station regularly. But when I asked a maintenance technician about it, he looked confused and told me no recalibration had been scheduled for that section. Before I could ask more, Ethan appeared at my elbow and suggested an alternate route. He did not ask which way I wanted to go. He simply walked, and I followed, and the alternate path was 3 minutes longer, but passed through 2 security checkpoints instead of none. A Dren trade attaché named Vorin, who had cornered me at a reception 2 weeks earlier, and asked oddly specific questions about my daily schedule and which routes I preferred, was transferred off the station. I learned this casually from a colleague, who mentioned it in passing, as though it were unremarkable. You cannot see it, cannot point to the source, but you feel it moving against your skin, and you know that somewhere, a door is open that should not be. And through it all, Ethan Cole was there, behind me, beside me, near the wall, near the door, near whatever exit was closest. His emotional wall never cracked, his face never changed. He said ma'am and understood and good morning with the same flat, even tone. And he watched everything with those gray eyes that moved like searchlights, slow and steady and missing nothing. It was a rest day, and I decided to visit the station's commercial ring, a sprawling market level, where merchants from a dozen species sold everything from Velhari crystals to synthesized Kethvari silk. I did not tell Ethan I was going. I simply left my quarters during a period when he usually took his brief meal break, hoping to walk unaccompanied for the first time in weeks. He was waiting at the lift, not following me, waiting, as though he had known where I was going before I did. He did not acknowledge the test. He simply fell into step beside me, slightly behind, and adjusted his pace to match mine. The commercial ring was crowded, loud, and empathically overwhelming. 100 emotional signatures crashed against my senses, like waves against a cliff. Joy, boredom, avarice, excitement, the sharp spike of an argument between a vendor and a customer, the low hum of contentment from a family browsing trinkets. I let it wash over me, trying to relax, trying to feel normal for 1 hour. I was examining a stall of Velhari light crystals, holding one up to watch it refract the overhead lights into fractured rainbows, when my empathic sense seized. There is no better word for it. One moment I was feeling the ambient noise of the crowd, and the next, something cut through it like a blade through silk. Intent, sharp, focused, and aimed in my direction. Not an emotion exactly, more like the shape of one, the outline of something purposeful and cold, and it was close. Very close. I froze. The crystal slipped from my fingers, and the vendor caught it with a disapproving chirp. My bioluminescence surged, the markings along my temples flaring bright blue-white, a stress response I could not control. Then, Ethan was beside me. Not behind me, beside me. He had crossed 4 meters in less time than it took me to register his movement. His body was between me and the crowd, blocking the direction the intent had come from, and his hand was on my arm. Not gripping, just there, a point of contact, an anchor. "Let's head back, ma'am," he said, same voice, same tone, as though suggesting we leave a restaurant because the service was slow. "This section gets crowded around shift change." His hand was trembling. Not with fear. I could feel that much through the contact. The trembling was restraint. His body wanted to do something his mind was forbidding it to do, and the effort of holding himself still was creating a physical vibration that I could feel through my skin. I let him guide me out. Through the crowd, past the stalls, into the quieter corridors beyond. His hand stayed on my arm until we reached the lift, and then he released me and stepped back, and his emotional wall sealed shut so completely, it was as though the past 5 minutes had not happened. At my quarters, I turned to face him. "What was that, Ethan?" "Crowd dynamics, ma'am. Did not like the flow patterns." I stared at him. He stared back. His face was a mask of professional calm. But I had felt the trembling. I had felt the way his entire body had reoriented itself to become a barrier between me and the crowd, smooth and automatic, like a door swinging shut. I knew he was not telling me the truth, not because I read his mind, because deception has a texture when you are Salith, and his felt like sandpaper dragged across glass. Rough, deliberate, and practiced enough that he had clearly done it many times before. I let it go. But that night, I sat alone in my quarters and thought about the trembling in his hand, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever he had sensed in that market, it had not been crowd dynamics. Something had been coming for me, and Ethan had put himself in front of it before I could even identify the direction. 2 days later, I went to see Calith. Senior emissary Calith Norves had been stationed on Andris 9 for 11 years. She was old by Salith standards. Her bioluminescent markings faded to a soft silver that glowed like moonlight on still water. She had negotiated more treaties than I had read, survived 2 station-wide crises, and once talked a Kethvari warship out of opening fire on a civilian transport by standing in front of a view screen and telling the captain that his anger was justified, but his target was not. She was the closest thing I had to a mentor in deep space, and she did not tolerate uncertainty. She listened without interrupting, her silver markings dimming steadily. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Their embassy budget on this station is barely enough to keep their own people fed. Whatever resources they are spending on Ethan Cole's presence, they are spending them deliberately, and they are not spending them on cultural exchange. Her markings went dark, completely dark. A Salith expression of deep, absolute concern. Protection, she said. The humans only embed their soldiers when they expect danger. Not the possibility of danger, the certainty of it. If Ethan Cole is standing behind you every day, it is because someone in Terran intelligence looked at this station, looked at this treaty, and decided that you specifically were going to be targeted. I asked. Because the humans understand something. I left Calith's quarters with my thoughts churning and my markings flickering like a broken signal light. If she was right, if the humans had placed Ethan with me because they expected someone to try to remove me from the treaty process, then every unexplained event of the past month had a new context. The atmospheric filter replaced at 3 in the morning. He was not a shadow. He was not a cultural liaison who happened to follow me everywhere with flat eyes and scarred knuckles. He was a wall, placed between me and something I could not see. I started watching him after that, and what I saw frightened me more than anything else. He did not sleep. Not truly. The station's corridor sensors logged biometric data for every resident, a security feature I had access to as a delegation leader, and Ethan's data told a story that made my chest tight. His sleep periods averaged 90 minutes, sometimes less. Always in a position facing the door, always within 3 seconds of standing, and every night, between 02 and 05 o'clock, his biometrics appeared in the corridor outside my quarters. Every single night. Standing, sitting, sometimes pacing slowly, but always there. He ate once a day. A single meal, consumed quickly, always in a seat that faced the entrance of whatever room he was in. He had mapped the station. Not the public routes that any visitor could find on a terminal display, but the full network, maintenance corridors, emergency hatches, service tunnels, ventilation access points. I knew this because I once took a deliberate detour, turning down a corridor I had never used before, and Ethan did not hesitate. He did not check a map. He did not slow down. He simply adjusted his path, and when I glanced back, he was exactly 10 steps behind me, as though he had walked this route 100 times. I stopped in the corridor and turned to face him. The question had been building for days, and I could not hold it any longer. "What are you really doing here, Sergeant?" He stopped, met my eyes. That same gray stone gaze, steady and unrevealing. "My job, ma'am." "And what is your job?" A pause, longer than his usual responses. Something shifted behind his wall, a deep movement, like tectonic plates settling. For one heartbeat, I felt the shape of what he held back. Enormous, disciplined, and fierce, so fierce that the echo of it made my markings flare. "Keeping you safe," he said. He said it simply, the way you would say the sky is blue or water is wet, as though it were the most obvious fact in the universe, and he could not understand why I was asking. I opened my mouth to respond, to demand more, to push past that wall of calm and get to the truth beneath it. But something in his voice stopped me. Not the words, the weight behind them, the way "keeping you safe" sounded in his mouth like a vow rather than a job description. I let it go, again. But that night, at 03:22 station time, I heard something through the thin wall of my quarters, a sound that did not belong in a residential corridor in the middle of the station's night cycle. A scuffle, brief, controlled, and quiet. Not loud enough to trigger the corridor's audio alarms, not long enough to register as more than a momentary disturbance. If I had been sleeping, I would never have heard it, but I was awake, lying in the dark, thinking about maps and meal schedules, and a man who slept 90 minutes a night. I heard the scuffle, and then I heard silence. I waited 3 minutes. Then I opened my door. The corridor was empty. The lights were at their usual night cycle dim, casting long blue shadows along the walls. There was no sign of anyone, except a smear on the wall at knee height. A mark, dark against the pale station surface, roughly the length of my hand. I crouched and looked at it more closely. It was red. Deep, rich red, still damp. It was human. I stared at it. My markings were blazing, casting their own pale light across the corridor floor. The smear was small, not a catastrophe. But it was there, real and warm and undeniable, evidence of something that had happened right outside my door while I lay in the dark. In the morning, Ethan was at his usual post, standing near my door, hands behind his back, eyes forward. "Good morning, ma'am." I looked at his arms. His sleeves were pulled to his wrists, which was unusual. He typically rolled them to his forearms. Beneath the fabric of his left sleeve, I could see the faint outline of a bandage, wrapped tight from wrist to elbow. He followed my gaze. His expression did not change. "Good morning, Ethan," I said. He nodded once and waited for me to lead the way to the council chamber. Neither of us mentioned the corridor. Neither of us mentioned the mark on the wall. By the time I returned to my quarters that evening, it had been cleaned away, and the only evidence that it had existed was the memory in my head and the bandage on his arm. I lay in bed that night and thought about a man who fought something in the dark outside my door, bled for it, bandaged himself, and showed up the next morning with a "good morning, ma'am," and unchanged eyes. And I thought about the thing Caliph had said. The humans only embed their soldiers when they expect danger, not the possibility, the certainty. The treaty negotiations entered their most critical phase 11 weeks after my arrival, and with them, everything got worse. First Speaker Thesic had abandoned all pretense of diplomatic courtesy. In the council chamber, his contempt was no longer a background radiation I could manage. It was a directed beam, aimed at me personally, hot enough to make my vision swim. He challenged every clause I proposed. He interrupted my statements. He made references to the Salith's biological tricks, in a tone that turned our empathic abilities into something shameful, something to be distrusted. And beneath the words, beneath the political performance, I could feel something else from him, something darker than contempt. Satisfaction. As though he knew something I did not, and he was enjoying watching me work without knowing it. The Dren Collective delegate, a slow-moving aquatic named Counselor Dreth, was no better. His proposals were deliberately vague, his language designed to create loopholes that would only become visible after the treaty was signed. I caught 3 of them in a single session, each one buried in subordinate clauses that would have given the Dren unilateral extraction rights in contested zones. Each time I pointed them out, Dreth's emotional signature pulsed with a cold, calculating annoyance, like a chess player watching an opponent find a move they thought was hidden. I was good at my job, I knew that. But the sessions were draining me. 12 hours in a room full of hostile minds left me shaking, my bioluminescence stuttering like a failing light, my head pounding with the residue of emotions that were not mine. On the worst nights, I could not eat. The emotional toxins I absorbed during the day sat in my body like spoiled food, and the thought of putting anything in my stomach made me physically ill. The lighting in the corridor outside the council chamber was adjusted the morning after a particularly brutal session. The harsh white panels had been replaced with a softer spectrum, close to the ambient light of my homeworld, the kind of light that eased empathic strain rather than amplifying it. When I asked the station's facilities manager about it, she told me a Terran security officer had submitted a request citing delegation wellness protocols. Inside was a container of Feralis tea, a Salith herbal blend that soothed the neural pathways empaths used to process external emotions. It was rare off-world, expensive, and prepared correctly, which meant someone had not just obtained it, but learned the precise water temperature and steeping time required to activate its medicinal properties. There was no note, but I knew. When I returned from sessions that left me barely able to walk, Ethan shortened his distance from 10 steps behind to 3, close enough that if I stumbled, he could reach me. He matched his pace to mine without being asked. And he maintained that deliberate emotional quiet, that compressed wall of nothing, which I was beginning to understand was not emptiness but intention. He was muting himself, deliberately making his emotional presence as small as possible, so that I had one less signal to process, one less mind pressing against my shields. I asked him how he knew about Feralis tea. "Read a monograph on Salith physiology," he said. Seemed relevant to the assignment. He had read a Salith medical text. A human, a species with no empathic ability, no telepathic capacity, no biological framework for understanding what I experienced, had sat down and read a scientific paper on Salith neural architecture. For the assignment. I looked at him standing there, gray-eyed and expressionless, and felt something I had not expected. Not gratitude, though there was that. Not curiosity, though that was there too. Something warmer. Something that had no right to exist between a Salith diplomat and her furniture. Respect. 8 days before the treaty's scheduled signing, the Dren Collective made a move that changed everything. Councillor Dreth requested a closed session, excluding all non-essential staff. The request was unusual, but not unprecedented, and the other delegations agreed. For the first time in weeks, Ethan was not in the room with me. He was outside, on the other side of a sealed door, and I could feel his emotional wall from 20 meters away, compressed tighter than I had ever felt it. Inside, Dreth presented intelligence. He had documentation, sources, intercepted communications. There were entities who would lose billions if it succeeded, and they had decided that the most efficient way to prevent its success was not to attack the treaty itself, but to remove the one person whose empathic abilities made deception at the negotiating table impossible. Me. The assassination attempt at the market had not been an isolated event. It was one node in a larger operation. There were more. There had been more. And there would be more. The other delegates spoke over each other. I sat in my chair and felt the temperature of the room climb, as fear and anger and political calculation crashed against my shields in waves. But beneath the chaos, one thought kept repeating in my mind, clear and cold. Ethan knew. He had known before I arrived, before the market, before the corridor, before every morning and every, "Good morning, ma'am." He had known someone was going to try to end my life, and he had placed himself between me and that threat, without ever telling me it existed. The session broke apart. Delegates retreated to their quarters to confer with their governments. Security was tripled across the diplomatic wing. Emergency protocols were activated. The station commander appeared on screens across Andrus 9, calm and authoritative, assuring everyone that measures were being taken. I walked out of the council chamber and found Ethan standing exactly where I knew he would be, against the wall, facing the door, hands behind his back. "You knew," I said. He did not deny it. He did not explain. He looked at me with those gray eyes, and for the first time, I saw something shift behind them. Not the wall cracking. Something intentional. A door opening a fraction of an inch. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "How long?" "Before you boarded the station." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Before I boarded the station. Before I met him. Before I dismissed him as furniture and unremarkable and dull. He had known. And he had come anyway. My voice was barely a whisper. "How many times, Ethan?" The door behind his eyes closed, gently, but completely. He held my gaze, and I watched him make the decision not to answer. Not out of secrecy, out of something else. something I could feel pressing against the wall, warm and fierce. He did not want to scare me. "Enough," he said. "But you are still here, ma'am. That is what matters." I stared at him, this heavy, quiet, impossible man who had reorganized his entire existence around keeping me breathing, who slept 90 minutes a night, who read Salith medical texts, who fought in dark corridors and bandaged himself and said nothing, who had decided, before he ever met me, that my life was his responsibility, and had carried that weight every single day without complaint, without recognition, without anyone even knowing. I asked, not as a diplomat, not as a Salith, as a person standing in front of another person, desperate to understand. 3 words. That was all. No grand explanation. No philosophical justification. Because someone has to. As though protecting a stranger from another world, at the cost of your own sleep, your own safety, your own body, was simply what you did when you saw something that needed doing. I went to my quarters that night and sat in the dark and tried to make sense of what I was feeling. Not the emotions I had absorbed from the council chamber, not the fear or the anger or the political tension. Something underneath all of that, something mine, rising up from a place I did not know existed. I sat there for hours, my markings glowing soft and steady in the dark, and I thought about the word he had used. Enough. How many times, Ethan? Enough. Enough that he had decided, somewhere in that locked and disciplined mind, that the truth would be a burden, and the burden was his to carry. And late that night, long after the station had gone quiet, and the corridors were empty, and I should have been asleep, I heard his voice. Not through the wall, through the ventilation system, which carried sound in thin, distorted threads, if you were close enough, and the station was silent enough. He was speaking to someone on a secure channel, his voice low and flat, and the encryption caught most of it, turning his words into static. But one sentence came through clear. "No, sir, she does not know. She can never know how many there have been." I sat in the dark with those words ringing in my ears, and my markings blazed so bright, they lit up the room like a flare. How many? How many had there been? The emergency session had been called after a second wave of intelligence confirmed what Counselor Dreth had revealed. The conspiracy was wider than anyone had estimated. Intercepted communications pointed to coordinated threats from at least 4 separate actors, some political, some corporate, operating across species lines. The treaty signing was 5 days away, and the forces opposing it were running out of time, which meant they were getting desperate. The council chamber was packed. Every delegation had doubled their security presence. The Kethvari had brought their own guards, massive insectoid soldiers in ceremonial armor, whose emotional signatures radiated menace like heat from a furnace. The Dren had deployed their own intelligence officers, aquatic beings in sealed environmental suits whose cold, calculating focus added a chill to the empathic atmosphere that made me shiver. And then there were the humans. 2 additional Terran security officers had been assigned to the wing, and they flanked the chamber entrance like statues carved from granite. But Ethan was inside, standing behind my chair, closer than he had ever stood during a session. Close enough that I could feel his body heat against my back, that furnace warmth that humans carried with them everywhere. The session began, and it was immediately clear that Thesic had abandoned negotiation entirely. He was grandstanding, delivering a monologue about Kethvari sovereignty that was designed not to advance the treaty but to stall it. His emotional signature was a deliberate broadcast of righteous anger, performed for the room, while underneath it, I could feel something else: anticipation. I was holding, but barely. My bioluminescence was flickering, an involuntary response to empathic overload, and my hands were shaking beneath the table. I needed to speak. I needed to counter Thessic's stalling with a clear, calm restatement of the Salith position. But every time I opened my mouth, another wave of hostile emotion crashed against me, and the words dissolved. Ethan leaned forward. An anchor, a reminder. Thessic's mandibles parted in what passed for a grin among his species, and his emotional signature shifted from performance to genuine, ugly satisfaction. At the same moment, I felt the door. Not the physical door, the empathic door. A mind entering the room that I had not felt before, because whoever it belonged to had been shielding themselves, and they had just stopped. Their emotional signature flooded the chamber like a burst pipe, and it was pure, focused, purposeful intent, cold and sharp as a blade, and it was aimed at me. I turned. A Kethvari attendant was moving through the crowd near the edge of the chamber. They carried a tray, the same kind of tray every attendant carried, loaded with drink containers, arranged in neat rows. But their emotional signature was screaming, not fear, not anger, purpose. The empty, hollow purpose of someone who has accepted a task and is beyond doubt or hesitation. I did not even have time to finish my thought. Ethan moved. He did not run. Running would have been too slow and too obvious. What he did was something I had never seen a human do, something that rewrote my understanding of what their heavy, gravity-built bodies were capable of. He flowed. One moment he was behind my chair, and the next he was 4 meters away, between me and the attendant, and his hands were already in motion, precise and controlled, the way you might imagine a machine operating, if the machine had been trained for decades to perform exactly this task. He reached the attendant before the weapon cleared the wrap. His right hand caught the attendant's wrist and redirected it downward, while his left hand found the weapon itself, a sleek metallic cylinder that I recognized with a stab of horror. A neural disruptor, designed to target empathic neural pathways, a weapon built specifically to harm someone like me. The attendant was twice Ethan's size, an insectoid with armored chitin plating and 4 arms. It should not have been possible for a human to restrain one. But Ethan did not try to restrain. He redirected, used the attendant's own momentum against them, angled their body off balance, and brought them down with a controlled pivot that ended with the Kethvari face first on the marble floor, and the disruptor skidding harmlessly across the chamber. The room detonated into chaos. Delegates shouted. Guards surged forward. Thessic's satisfaction curdled into something that felt like shock, whether at the failure of the attempt or at the speed of its prevention, I could not tell. But I was not watching any of that. I was watching Ethan. He was kneeling on the attendant's back, one hand maintaining control, while the other pressed the Kethvari's weapon arm flat against the floor. His breathing was steady, his expression had not changed, that same flat, professional calm, as though disarming someone in a crowded diplomatic chamber was as routine as walking me to breakfast. The stress, the adrenaline, the sheer physical effort of moving that fast and that precisely. Something broke in his emotional compression, and what came through was a wave of feeling so intense it nearly knocked me off my feet. Fury. But not the hot, chaotic fury I had felt from Thessic, or the cold calculation of the Dren. This was something else entirely. Structured, organized. Fury that had been cataloged and filed and cross-referenced. Fury that knew names and dates and contingency plans. Fury that had been awake for months, watching, waiting, running scenarios in the background of every quiet moment. Fury that was not rage at all, but something much more frightening. It was devotion. Devotion with teeth. The absolute, unwavering commitment of a person who had decided that this thing, this one thing, would not happen. Not on his watch. Not while he was breathing. And the fury existed only because someone had dared to try. And it was all pointed at the being who had aimed a weapon at me. The full depth of it, just for an instant, like staring into a canyon during a lightning flash and seeing all the way to the bottom. The session was suspended indefinitely. Through all of it, Ethan stood at the edge of the room, filed a report on his communicator, and returned to his post as though nothing had happened. I found him in the corridor afterward, standing in his usual spot, hands behind his back. He had a fresh mark on his right forearm, where the Kethvari's chitin had scraped him during the takedown. He had not treated it. "Sergeant Cole," I said, and my voice cracked on his name. He looked at me, calm, steady, ready. "That was a neural disruptor," I said. "That weapon was designed specifically to target Salith physiology. It would have shut down my empathic cortex permanently. You knew what it was. You recognized it instantly." He said nothing. "Cultural liaisons do not know what neural disruptors look like," I said. "Cultural liaisons do not study Salith-specific weaponry. Cultural liaisons do not move like that." Silence. "Who are you, Ethan?" He held my gaze for a long moment. And then he smiled. It was the first real smile I had ever seen on his face, small and tired and warm, in a way that made my chest ache and my markings glow. "Someone who is very good at his job," he said softly. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to thank him. I wanted to reach through that impossible wall and pull out every secret he was keeping, and lay them in the light where I could see them. But the taboo held. I could not read his mind. I would not. "Thank you," I said instead. The words felt inadequate, the way a cup feels inadequate next to an ocean. He nodded once. "Just positioning, ma'am. Right place, right time." We both knew that positioning did not explain a human who recognized alien weaponry on sight and moved through a crowd like water through stone. But he offered me the lie like a gift, a way to go back to normal, to pretend this was manageable, to sleep tonight without thinking about how close it had been. I took it, because I was not ready for the alternative. But late that night, sitting in the dark again, I thought about the crack. That one instant when his wall had broken, and I had felt what was inside. The fury, the devotion, the absolute, structured, terrifying commitment to keeping me alive. And I thought about a human body moving through space with a precision that should not have been possible, covering 4 meters in less than a heartbeat, reaching a weapon before it could be drawn, because failure was not an option he had ever considered. I had spent my career studying the emotions of other species. And I was beginning to suspect that the thing I did not understand was the most important thing in the room. Weeks of empathic bombardment, the constant pressure of hostile minds pressing against my shields, the weight of knowing that someone wanted me gone, and only one person stood between me and that outcome. My neural pathways were strained. I could feel them the way you feel a muscle that has been overused. A dull, persistent ache behind my temples that no amount of Feralis tea could touch. My barriers were thin, I knew it. On a normal day, my empathic shields were layered and strong, built up over years of training, capable of filtering the emotional noise of a crowded room into manageable background static. But this was not a normal day. My shields felt like wet paper. Every emotion in my vicinity landed on my skin without filtration, raw and immediate, and I spent the morning flinching at feelings that were not mine. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. He shortened his distance to 2 steps. He adjusted the lighting in the corridor before I entered it. He brought Feralis tea to my door without being asked. And he maintained that deliberate compression, that emotional silence, stronger than ever, as though he was trying to make himself invisible to my senses. It helped. His quiet was a refuge, a pocket of calm in a station that felt like it was screaming. But it was not enough. The emergency session was called at midday. Every delegation, full attendance. The topic was the intelligence Dreth had presented, the coordinated conspiracy, and the question of whether the treaty could proceed at all under these conditions. The chamber was a war zone of emotions. fear from the smaller delegations who had no security forces of their own, anger from the Kethvari, whether genuine or performed I could no longer tell, cold, analytical focus from the Dren, anxiety from my own people. And beneath all of it, the low, constant hum of danger, that ambient feeling of a room where everyone knows something terrible is possible, and no one knows when it will happen. I sat at the Salith delegation's table and gripped its edge with both hands. My markings were flickering, pulsing between dim and bright in a rhythm I could not control. My head was pounding. Every speaker who stood to address the chamber sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing against my shields, and I felt them buckling, felt the structure I had spent my life building beginning to crack under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Ethan was behind me, close, closer than he had ever stood during a session. I could feel his warmth against my back, steady and constant, and his emotional wall was a fortress, silent and solid, the only stable thing in a room full of storms. The session ground forward. Thesik's replacement, a younger Kethvari named Second Speaker Vrek, was no less hostile but more controlled. Dreth presented additional intelligence. A Velhari delegate proposed a security review. I stood. The room swam. Every mind in the chamber pressed against me at once. A tsunami of emotion, fear, and anger, and suspicion, and calculation, and my shields did not buckle. They collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually. Completely, like a wall of glass shattering into dust. One moment I had shields, and the next I had nothing, standing raw and exposed in a room full of minds, feeling everything from everyone all at once, 100 emotional signatures pouring into me, without filter or protection. My vision went white. My bioluminescence blazed so bright that delegates at the nearest tables shielded their eyes. I heard someone call my name, distant, muffled, as though from the bottom of a well. His hand found my shoulder, firm and grounding, a point of contact that cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog. His other hand caught my elbow, steadying me. His body was warm, impossibly warm, that human furnace heat radiating through his uniform into my skin. "I'm here," he said. "Quiet. Just for me. Focus on my voice, ma'am. I'm right here." His voice was an anchor. His hand on my shoulder was an anchor. His warmth was an anchor. And my shattered barriers, searching desperately for something to hold on to in the storm, found him. And latched on. I did not mean to do it. I need to say that. I need to say it clearly. Because what happened next broke the most sacred law of my people, and I did not choose it. My telepathic ability, my deepest and most forbidden sense, the one I had spent my entire life keeping locked and dormant, activated on reflex. My barriers were gone. His hand was on my skin. His mind was right there, warm and close and unshielded, and my ability reached for the nearest stable signal the way a drowning person reaches for a hand. I fell into his mind. Not a flash, not an echo. Not the faint emotional impressions I had been catching for weeks through his wall. The full depth of it, complete and total and devastating. His mind was nothing like I had imagined. It was not quiet. It was not the cold, compressed vault I had pictured. It was vast, cathedral vast. A space so immense and so meticulously organized that the scale of it stole my breath. Every thought had a place. Every memory was filed. Every calculation, every contingency, every threat assessment was cataloged and cross-referenced and instantly accessible. And beneath the architecture, powering it like a reactor core at the center of a ship, was an emotional depth that made everything I had ever felt from any species look like a puddle next to an ocean. He was never a cultural liaison. The assignment was a cover, authorized at the highest levels of Terran military intelligence. He was a warden, a specialist in the Terran Special Operations Division, trained specifically for the protection of high-value diplomatic targets in hostile environments. He had volunteered for this posting, not been assigned, volunteered, because the intelligence reports that crossed his desk 3 months before I ever boarded a shuttle to Andros 9 flagged active threats against the Salith delegation, and against me specifically. And something in those reports made him close the file, walk to his commanding officer's desk, and say 4 words. "I will do it." I saw the threats. Not one. Not the market. Not the corridor. Not the chamber. 11. 11 separate attempts to end my life that I never knew about. The atmospheric filter in my quarters had not been replaced for routine maintenance. It had been contaminated with a compound designed to trigger cascading neural failure in Salith physiology, odorless and undetectable by standard sensors. Ethan found it at 03:14 station time because he tested my air supply every single night. He removed the filter, replaced it with a clean one from emergency storage, and submitted the incident through encrypted Terran channels without ever waking me. The corridor closure was not atmospheric recalibration. A remote-triggered concussive device had been placed in the ceiling panels of the corridor I used every morning. Ethan found it during one of his nightly patrols of the station's maintenance network. He disarmed it himself because calling station security would have taken 11 minutes, and his risk calculation told him the device might have a timer. Vorin, the Dren attaché who asked about my schedule, was not transferred. He was an intelligence operative, contracted by corporate interests in the Dren Collective, tasked with mapping my movements, vulnerabilities, and daily patterns for a team that was planning a targeted operation. Ethan intercepted his communications, confronted him in a maintenance corridor at 02 o'clock, and gave him a choice. I saw the data broker who had been selling my biometric data, my sleep schedule, my empathic sensitivity ratings, to the highest bidder. Ethan tracked him down through 3 layers of encrypted contacts and ensured he understood the consequences of continuing. I saw the monitoring device planted in my office, disguised as a routine environmental sensor, that was transmitting my conversations to a listening post on the station's commercial ring. Ethan found it, disabled it, and let its operators believe it was still functioning, while he fed them false information about my schedule and movements. I saw the attendant who brought altered food to a reception I attended, food laced with a compound that would have sensitized my empathic cortex to the point where the emotional noise of the room would have triggered a seizure. Ethan swapped my plate before I sat down. I saw every one of the 11 threats, each one detailed and specific and real, each one a moment when my life hung on the actions of a man who slept 90 minutes a night and ate once a day and stood in dark corridors at 3 in the morning because he had decided, before he ever met me, that I would not be harmed. And I saw the cost. I saw the injuries he hid, the cracked ribs from the corridor confrontation with a Kethvari operative. Taped tight with medical adhesive, he applied himself in a maintenance closet because going to the medical bay would have taken him off post for 2 hours. The concussion he treated with medications he kept in his pocket. The wound on his thigh from an encounter I never knew about, which got infected for 3 days because he would not leave my corridor long enough to see a medic, and which he finally treated only when the infection began to slow his reaction time, and he calculated that the risk of being impaired outweighed the risk of being absent. I saw him sitting in a maintenance closet at 4 in the morning, hands shaking from exhaustion, pressing a cold compress to a bruise on his ribs, and telling himself, 15 more minutes. Just 15 more minutes and then you can rest. He never rested. And beneath all of it, woven through every memory and every calculation, like thread through fabric, I felt the reason. Not duty. Not orders. Not training. Not professional obligation. He cared. It was that simple, and that enormous. Somewhere in the first week, somewhere between watching me navigate a room full of hostile minds and seeing me sit alone in my quarters afterward, drained and exhausted, and still determined to go back the next day, something in Ethan Cole's heart made a decision that had nothing to do with his orders and everything to do with who he was. He thought I was brave. That was the word in his mind, the word he returned to again and again. Brave. He watched me walk into rooms where every mind was a weapon aimed at my head, and he thought I was the bravest person he had ever met. He thought my work mattered. He believed, with a conviction that ran deeper than any order or oath, that the galaxy needed the treaty to succeed and that I was the only person who could make it happen. And so he had decided, quietly, without fanfare, without telling anyone, without expecting recognition, or gratitude, or even acknowledgement. He had decided that my life was worth whatever it cost to protect, and the cost, it turned out, was everything. His sleep, his health, his safety, his body, everything. Offered without hesitation and without complaint by a man I had dismissed as furniture. I saw one last memory before the connection broke. It was recent, 2 nights ago. Tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, into something cellular, bone deep, the kind of tired that accumulates over months and never fully recedes. His ribs ached, his thigh throbbed, his eyes burned, and he was listening. To me, through the wall, to the soft, rhythmic sound of my breathing as I slept, listening to make sure, just making sure. In his mind, as he sat there in the dark, a single thought repeated like a heartbeat. Still breathing, still safe, still here. I wrenched myself out of his mind. The connection severed. I was standing in the council chamber, shaking so hard my teeth were rattling, tears streaming down my face, my bioluminescence blazing with such intensity that delegates across the room were squinting and shielding their eyes. Every Salith in the chamber was staring at me with expressions of dawning horror, because they knew. They could feel the telepathic resonance hanging in the air like the echo of a bell. They knew what I had done. Ethan stared at me. His hand was still on my shoulder. He had not moved. His face was pale, drained of color, and for the first time since I met him, his expression had changed. The mask was gone. The flat, professional calm was gone. What remained was fear, not the structured, controlled readiness I had felt from him before. Raw fear. Human fear, primal and unprocessed, the kind that comes from a place deeper than thought. But it was not fear of me. It was fear for me. Because I now knew things. Things that made me dangerous. Things that, if the wrong people discovered I knew them, would make me an even bigger target than I already was. "Ma'am," he said. One word. His voice cracked on it. I pulled away from his hand. I backed up. Every Salith in the room was still staring at me, and I could feel their judgment and their horror and their pity crashing against my raw, unshielded senses, and I could not bear it. I could not bear any of it. I turned and walked out of the chamber. Then I ran. I reached my quarters and locked the door and collapsed against it and slid to the floor. My body was shaking. My mind was full of his memories, his feelings, his quiet, relentless, incomprehensible devotion. 11 attempts. 11 times I almost ceased to exist, and he had stopped every single one, alone, in the dark, without a word. I thought he was furniture. He was a fortress. and I had just committed the most forbidden act in Salith culture by entering his mind without his permission. By our oldest laws, I now owed him either a life debt, a formal obligation that would bind me to his service, or a bond, a connection, something deeper, something permanent, something that could never be undone. I sat on the floor of my quarters and pressed my hands to my face and felt his last memory echoing in my chest. Still breathing, still safe, still here. And for the first time in my life, I did not know what I was more afraid of, the debt or the bond. I did not leave my quarters for a full station day. I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling and processed what I had done. Not just the tactical implications, not just the political fallout, but the personal reality of it. I had been inside another person's mind without their permission. I had seen his fears, his wounds, his feelings about me, things he had chosen to keep private, things he had locked behind that wall with the same discipline he used to keep me alive. I had stolen them from him. Among my people, there is no greater trespass. A Salith who reads another mind without consent has taken something that can never be returned. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot unknow what you have learned. The memories I carried, Ethan's memories, his pain, his devotion, his 3 a.m. vigils outside my door, those were mine now, permanently, woven into my neural pathways as thoroughly as my own experiences. I owed him a debt I did not know how to repay. Ethan came to my door. I felt him there, on the other side, his compressed emotional signature pressing against the metal like a hand pressed flat against glass. He knocked once, twice, called my name. Ma'am. Vitheris. Ma'am. His voice was steady, but behind the wall, I could feel the cracks. Guilt, as though what happened was somehow his fault, as though he had failed because his presence had triggered my collapse. And beneath the worry and the guilt, that same relentless undercurrent. Is she safe? Is she all right? Is she still there? I did not answer. I could not. Not yet. I lay in the dark and thought about what Caliph had told me weeks ago. The humans only embed their soldiers when they expect danger, not the possibility, the certainty. But Caliph had been wrong about one thing. She had framed it as a strategic decision. A calculation. The humans had assets in the field, and they deployed them where the risk-to-reward ratio justified the expense. Clinical, logical, the kind of reasoning any species would understand. But that was not what I had felt in Ethan's mind. There was no calculation. There was no risk-to-reward analysis. There was a man who read a file with my name on it, and felt something shift inside him. Something that was not strategy or duty or professional obligation, but something far older and far more powerful. A choice. Humans chose. That was the thing I kept circling back to, the thing that made them different from every other species I had studied. The Kethvari acted from instinct and hive drive. The Dren acted from calculation. My own people acted from empathic resonance, feeling what others felt and responding in kind. But humans who had no telepathy, no hive mind, no empathic sensitivity, nothing that compelled them toward connection, chose to care, deliberately, consciously, against their own interests, against their own survival instincts, against every rational argument for self-preservation. Ethan Cole looked at a file with a stranger's name on it and chose to bleed for her. Not because his biology demanded it, not because his culture required it. And I will prove it with my body and my time and my sleep and my silence. And I will never ask for anything in return. That was not strategy. That was love. Not the romantic kind. Something bigger. Something that did not have a word in any language I knew. I finally opened the door. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, exactly like the memory I had seen in his mind, the one from 3 in the morning, listening to me breathe through the metal. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, the eyes of a man who had not slept. He started to stand. "Stay," I said. He stayed. I sat down across from him, my back against the opposite wall, the corridor stretching away in both directions, empty and blue in the night cycle lighting. We sat there in the quiet and looked at each other, and for the first time since we met, there was no wall between us. Not because he had chosen to lower it, because I had already been behind it, and we both knew there was no point pretending otherwise. "I need to tell you what I did," I said, "and then I need to tell you what it means." I told him everything. I explained the taboo, the severity, the cultural weight of what had happened. I told him that I had not just caught a flash or an emotional echo. I had been fully inside his mind. I had seen his memories, his feelings, his injuries, his fear. I had seen the 11 threats. I had seen the nights outside my door. I had seen how he felt about me, the respect and the devotion, and the fierce, quiet belief that my work mattered enough to protect with everything he had. I told him I had no right to any of it. He listened without interrupting. His face was still, but not the flat professional mask I had grown accustomed to. Something open, something listening. When I finished, the corridor was quiet enough that I could hear the station's atmospheric systems humming in the walls. We sat in that silence for a long time. Then Ethan said, "Did it help?" I blinked. "What?" "Knowing," he said. All of it. The threats, the details, the things I kept from you. Did it help you to know? I opened my mouth and closed it again. It was not the question I had expected. I had expected anger. I had expected betrayal. I had taken his most private thoughts and held them up to the light without his permission, and he was asking if it helped me. It terrified me, I said honestly. He nodded, slowly, thinking. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Good, he said. You should be terrified, because the next 5 days are going to be the most dangerous of your life. The treaty signing is close, and the people who want to stop it are out of subtle options. Things are going to get loud. He paused, swallowed. And I need you to trust me, completely. No hesitation, no second guessing. If I tell you to move, you move. If I tell you to stay, you stay. I need you to believe, down to your bones, that I will keep you safe. He lowered his gaze from the ceiling and looked at me. So if it took you accidentally reading my mind to believe that, he said quietly, then I am glad you did it. I stared at him. The tears came again, sudden and hot, and my markings blazed in the corridor like twin lanterns. Because this was the most human thing I had ever witnessed. Not the strength, not the endurance, not the ability to function on 90 minutes of sleep and 1 meal a day, and injuries he treated himself. The choice to care more about my safety than his privacy, more about the mission than his own dignity. The choice to sit on a cold floor with red eyes and cracked ribs and say I am glad, because at least now you know. No. You should be. He shrugged. One shoulder, the one that did not have cracked ribs beneath it. I have been angry before, Vytheris. It does not fix anything, and right now the only thing that matters is getting you through those 5 days. He used my name, not ma'am, not a title. My name. And it sounded different in his voice than it had ever sounded before. Not because the word had changed, but because I now knew what it meant when he said it. I had felt the shape of my name in his mind, the weight he gave it, the care. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and took a breath. Then tell me the plan, I said. He told me. It was not just a plan, it was a strategy that had been building for months. Every threat Ethan had neutralized, he had documented. Every communication he had intercepted, every contact he had traced, every financial transaction he had uncovered, all of it had been compiled into an intelligence package so comprehensive and so damning that it could bring down the entire conspiracy in a single coordinated release. He had not just been guarding me. He had been building a weapon, not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of exposure, evidence, truth, the kind that could not be denied or deflected or buried. Go back into that chamber and close the treaty. Make it stick. Make it iron. Do what you do. And do not stop for anything. I will handle the rest. Ethan, they will try again. Yes. And you will be between me and whatever they send. Yes. I looked at him. This man who had answered yes to that question, the way he might answer yes to whether he wanted coffee. No drama. No heroics. Just a fact, stated plainly, the way you state that water is wet, or the sun is bright. I cannot ask you to do that, I said. He met my eyes, those gray eyes, warm now, open in a way they had never been before. You are not asking, he said. 5 days later, I walked into the council chamber for the final session. The room was different now. The additional security was visible, uniformed officers from 4 species positioned at every entrance and along the walls. The Kethvari delegation was reduced. Second speaker Vrek, present but subdued, his emotional signature tight with anxiety. The Dren were quiet, watchful, their aquatic suits humming softly. My own delegation was tense but resolute. And Ethan was behind me, where he had always been. But this time, I did not see him as a shadow. I did not see him as furniture. I saw him as he was, a human being who had spent months of his life making sure I would be alive to stand in this room on this day. The session began. The other delegations offered their own positions, each one more reasonable than anything that had come before. I understood why. The intelligence that Dreth had presented, the evidence of the conspiracy, had changed the political calculus. The species that had been supporting the opposition were pulling back, unwilling to be associated with a failed and exposed operation. The treaty's opponents were losing ground, and they knew it. But the session was still difficult. There were genuine disagreements to resolve, legitimate competing interests that required compromise, and the emotional temperature of the room was high. Fear and hope and calculation and ambition all swirled together, pressing against my unshielded empathic sense with relentless pressure. I held. Not because my barriers had rebuilt themselves, they had not. I was still raw, still unshielded, still absorbing every emotional current in the room without filter or protection. I held because I knew what was behind me. I knew the cost of the ground I was standing on. 11 times, that ground had been paid for. Every clause I negotiated, every compromise I brokered, every moment I stood and spoke with clarity and calm in a room full of hostile minds. I did it knowing that a man with cracked ribs and sleepless eyes, and a heart too stubborn to stop, had made this moment possible. I was better than I had ever been, not despite the fear, not despite the pressure, not despite knowing that someone might try again at any moment. Because of it. Because a human had taught me, without ever saying the words, that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more than the fear. The treaty took 9 hours to finalize. 9 hours of negotiation, compromise, revision, and emotional endurance that left me drained to my core. Not from any individual, from all of them. Relief. Genuine, shared, collective relief. The feeling of people who had been holding their breath for weeks, finally allowing themselves to exhale. While I negotiated, Ethan's evidence moved. He had timed it precisely, coordinating with Terran intelligence, station security, and allied agencies across 3 species. The intelligence package was released simultaneously to every relevant authority. Financial records, communication transcripts, operational plans, names, dates, accounts, and connections. Everything he had spent months collecting, every piece of evidence from every threat he had neutralized, delivered in a single coordinated burst that left no room for denial. By the time the treaty was signed, the first detentions were already underway. On the commercial ring, in the diplomatic wing, on transport ships docked at the station's outer ring. The conspiracy that had spent months trying to end my life was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a man who had built the tools for its destruction, while sitting in dark corridors at 3 in the morning. After the signing, the delegation celebrated. There were speeches and toasts, and the ritual exchanges of diplomatic courtesy that marked the end of a successful negotiation. And then I went to find Ethan. He was in the corridor. Where else would he be? Standing in his usual spot, hands behind his back, watching the celebration from a distance. The additional security officers had been reassigned. The crisis was over. The threats had been neutralized. The treaty was signed. His job was done. I stood in front of him and looked up at his face, at those gray eyes that had watched over me for months, without asking for anything in return. He looked tired. More tired than I had ever seen him, the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond sleep deprivation into something existential. The weariness of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to stand without it. About what happens now, about the bond. He waited, listening. That open, quiet attention that I now understood was not emptiness, but the most focused form of presence I had ever encountered. I told him about the Salith bond law. I explained that my people believed the act of reading another mind created a connection that could not be broken, a thread between two beings that would persist for the rest of their lives. I told him that by falling into his mind, however accidentally, I had created such a thread between us. And by our oldest traditions, I owed him one of two things: a life debt, a formal, structured obligation, repaid through service and loyalty until the balance was restored, or a bond, something else entirely, something that had no equivalent in human language, as far as I knew. A permanent connection, freely chosen, between two beings who had seen each other completely and decided that the seeing was not something they wanted to undo. Who had read Salith medical texts because they seemed relevant to the assignment? Who had replaced my air filter at 3 in the morning and swapped my food at receptions and sat outside my door listening to me breathe because still breathing, still safe, still here, was the only thought that mattered. I do not have a word for what I want it to be, I said. Not in my language, not in yours. It is not debt, it is not obligation. It is not the kind of bond my people usually form. It is something I do not think any species has named, because I do not think any other species does what you do. What do I do? He asked softly. Not because your body compels you, not because your culture demands it. Then he said, "That is just being human, Vitheris." "No," I said. "That is being extraordinary. And I do not want to owe you a debt, Ethan. I want you to stay." He looked at me, those gray eyes, warm and tired, and full of something that made my markings glow steady and bright. "I was never going to leave," he said. We stood there in the corridor, two beings from different worlds, different biologies, different evolutionary histories, connected by a thread that neither of us fully understood, and neither of us wanted to cut. The station hummed around us. The diplomats celebrated in distant rooms. The galaxy turned, indifferent and vast. I once believed humans were the galaxy's most unremarkable species. No telepathy, no empathic sensitivity, no biological advantages worth mentioning. I looked at them and saw heavy bodies on a heavy world, clumsy and short-lived and loud, tolerated by the rest of the galaxy the way you tolerate a persistent but harmless neighbor. Something that does not show up on biological scans, or genetic analyses, or evolutionary models. Something that cannot be measured, or quantified, or explained by any scientific framework I have ever encountered. They choose, not because they must, not because they are built for it, not because the universe rewards them for it. They look at a stranger, an alien, a being from a world so different from theirs that they share almost nothing in common, and they decide, in some deep and private chamber of their stubborn, irrational, magnificent hearts, that this person matters. And then they will give everything they have to prove it. Their sleep, their comfort, their safety, their health, everything, without being asked, without expecting thanks, without ever once considering that they could simply walk away. That is not instinct. That is not programming. That is not the product of evolution, or culture, or training. That is will. Pure, undiluted, human will. The most powerful force I have ever encountered in any species, on any world, in any corner of this vast and indifferent galaxy. I still feel Ethan's mind sometimes. Not because I am reading it, because the bond is there now, thin and warm, a thread of connection that hums between us like a note, held just below the threshold of hearing. It carries his emotional signature, no longer compressed, no longer hidden behind that impossible wall. He lets me feel him now, the steady warmth, the quiet focus, the fierce, stubborn devotion that has not dimmed by a single degree since the day he read my file and chose. The same thing it has been saying from the very first day, from the moment he stood in my office doorway and said 3 words, and watched me dismiss him as furniture. The same thing he whispered in dark corridors and said through sealed doors, and thought, in the silence of 3 a.m., while listening to me breathe through the wall. I am here, I am here, I am here, and he is. He always is. That is the human promise, the one they do not make with words, because words are too small for it. They make it with presence, with action. With every sleepless night, and every hidden wound, and every morning that begins with, "Good morning, ma'am," and means I watched over you while you slept, and I will do it again tonight, and every night after, because I chose you, and I will keep choosing you, and nothing in this galaxy or any other will make me stop. That is humanity, and it is the most beautiful, terrifying, extraordinary thing I have ever known.